The US firearms industry generates tens of billions in revenue every year. And while much of that comes from civilian sales and military contracts, there's another surprising source: video games. You see, just like product placement in movies, gun manufacturers have licensing deals with video games. So when you're choosing your loadout in Call of Duty, you might unknowingly be supporting the arms industry. But what does that really mean for us as gamers? Is it business as usual, or are we part of something bigger? In this video, we're breaking down how these licensing deals work, exploring how gun manufacturers profit from video games, and asking if this type of exposure really affects their bottom line. Plus, we'll dive into debates around video game violence and what the deeper moral questions are when guns and games intersect. And speak directly to a developer from the studios we talk about to understand the mechanics and fallout of these partnerships. But before we get into it, since we're talking about guns, I have to use this opportunity to show you my handgun. There's no deep meaning behind this at all. I just got it because I thought it was a funny pun. It's a gun on my hand. It's a handgun. Like, if you didn't click off this video and subscribe after that, we're gonna be fine for the rest of this video. Let's begin with how product placement actually works. Just like in film and TV, if you see a brand, you can bet that a lot of money was exchanged. And just like in film and TV, game developers often negotiate with brands to use their products and logos. This usually involves a flat fee or a percentage of the game's sales. Take racing games like Gran Turismo. Brands like Ferrari or BMW are paid to have their cars used. And in sports games like NBA or FIFA, it's kind of the reverse, where brands like Nike, Adidas, or Under Armour pay for the exposure. And while we may notice these obvious brands or logos, what about the ones in our loadouts? In most AAA shooters like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Rainbow Six, the guns you use aren't just random designs. They're modeled after their real-world counterparts, sometimes down to the smallest details like recoil patterns and attachments. Developers know that for their audience, authenticity is key, and this realism makes the experience way more immersive, especially when you're recreating actual wars. But this is where the catch lies, because these guns aren't free to feature, and we're talking real money here. Some licensing deals range from a few $1,000s to a few $100,000, depending on the gun's brand power and the game's sale potential. In fact, standard fees typically range between 5 and 10% of the game's retail price. Essentially, this creates a direct link between us purchasing a game and gun manufacturers. And these deals aren't hypothetical. Barrett, famous for their sniper rifles, openly say that they charge developers a licensing fee to use their guns. Remington and Colt, who are other huge players in the firearms industry, have also openly charged licensing fees for their use of guns in games. But is this fair? Because if we're aiming for historical accuracy and use a Thompson and then Colt claim a fee, could this not then open up a slippery slope? Could companies like Brooks Brothers claim a licensing fee for their uniforms? Should it not be that every item used in games is open to a licensing fee, like radios, night vision goggles, rovers, and drones? Why is it only firearms? Where is this line, and who's the one that gets to draw it? This was exactly the argument EA made back in 2013. They decided to change the game and stop paying licensing fees for guns, opting to feature instead realistic but unbranded weapons in Battlefield. They argued that these weapons fell under fair use and were part of public domain culture, but it wasn't just about the money. This move followed the Sandy Hook tragedy, where many first-person shooters faced criticism for promoting gun use. EA's decision was also a way to distance themselves from the debate around video game violence. EA's defense hinged on the idea that different media are held to different standards. In their view, if a book uses the word like cult, for example, it's seen as a tool for historical accuracy and world building. But if a video game does the same, it becomes an intellectual property issue. So, why this double standard? The counter-argument here is actually pretty straightforward. Unlike in books, where a brand mention doesn't necessarily directly drive sales, video games build entire experiences around them. Developers profit directly from their inclusion, so the case for licensing becomes much stronger. Games also prioritize hyper-realism, with firearms replicated down to their smallest markings and brand details. This isn't just a casual reference, it's a detailed digital replica, and goes far beyond what's typically allowed under IP laws. And because video games are interactive, these branded items become integral to the gameplay, players engage with them, and this goes far beyond merely describing or naming an object. So this approach by EA came with serious risks, because gun manufacturers could sue at any time, and it all depended on whether the courts would side with EA's argument of depicting real products in realistic settings, or if they'd side with the manufacturers, arguing that EA needed to pay up for those rights. But what ultimately killed this move was, of course, us. Time and time again, when developers have tried to dodge fees by using off-brand generic guns, they're faced with a whole other nightmare: gamers on Reddit. And it's the kind of backlash that makes paying astronomical licensing fees seem like the reasonable alternative, as gamers were just dispositioned to never be happy or satisfied with anything, and the backlash from players was enough to spark some sort of legal debate, but it created no significant shift in how the gaming industry approached firearms. And of course, many smaller studios not as financially equipped as these major studios have adopted a strategy of using slightly altered names for guns. For example, instead of calling a gun an AK-47, they might call it an AKM or an assault rifle while maintaining a similar design. Apart from the standard of licensing fees in the industry, we also need to speak about the more overt exchanges, where arms manufacturers specifically pushed to have certain firearms featured. In 2009, Remington and Activision signed a deal to include the Remington Adaptive Combat Rifle, or ACR, in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, continuing into Modern Warfare 3 in 2011. The goal? To market the firearm to a younger audience by leveraging the game's popularity. But despite the ACR's in-game success, it didn't really translate into real-world sales, and the gun was eventually discontinued due to performance issues anyways. And in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, one of the more notable shotguns was the branded Remington 870 MCS. It became a fan favorite for its close-range effectiveness, but this model was specifically pushed by Remington in the hopes of translating into real-world sales of the gun. And while this is one deal that we specifically know of, it's no conspiracy theory to imagine that many more deals have gone both above and below the table to push specific firearms to gamers. But here's the question. Does marketing these firearms to gamers actually lead to real-world sales? Or in other words, when we're buying these games, are we unknowingly funding a marketing strategy for the gun industry? Well, the truth is the evidence isn't exactly clear. There's limited data linking video game exposure to a real-world spike in gun sales, but that doesn't mean the industry isn't trying. Some gun manufacturers use games as a marketing tool, banking on the idea that brand familiarity will lead to future sales. The logic here is that if gamers recognize and engage with a product, they might be more inclined to buy it later. And it's not just gun companies. The US military has been using video games as a promotional and recruitment tool for years. They also work closely with developers and give them consultation and even access to military hardware to ensure its accuracy. And they're not shy about it either. They even have an esports team that streams on Twitch. This is their channel. I was really hoping there'd be a lot of like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike here, but it's just Magic the Gathering. Not even an MMO, Magic the Gathering. And I'm not bashing card games, I love Hearthstone, it's just if I went to the US Army's esports team's Twitch page, I'd like to see a gun or two. By the way, if you're watching this and you're from the United States, this is where your tax dollars are going to. Anyways, back to the guns. Earlier, I mentioned one of the reasons EA distanced themselves from gun manufacturers was due to the backlash of the Sandy Hook massacre. One recurring argument from media is that video games promote violence, and violent video games are often used as a scapegoat or even a catalyst to domestic terrorism. But does the data actually back this up? Not exactly. Research into the connection between video games and real-world violence, especially in mass shootings, doesn't support any of the claims made by media or politicians. For example, in 2015, a study by the American Psychological Association found a slight increase in aggression linked to gaming, but it wasn't enough to suggest that games cause criminal behavior or shootings, and that aggression was only during the time of play. A 2019 study published in the Royal Society of Open Science focused on adolescent behavior and found no significant evidence that violent games led to aggression either. They also concluded that in countries like Japan and South Korea, where video game consumption is extremely high, they have very low rates of violent crime and gun-related deaths. So if video games were to blame, we'd see these numbers reflected globally. But we don't. And Oxford University researchers in 2019 also found that there was no link between the time spent playing video games and aggressive behavior. And in 2002, the US Secret Service and the Department of Education did a study analyzing school shootings, and they found that only 12% of the perpetrators expressed an interest in playing video games, and not that video games supported their ideals, suggesting that other factors were more relevant to their actions. The fact of the matter is that while some studies suggest a minor correlation between video games and short-term aggressions such as frustration or anger during play, there's no substantial evidence linking video games to real-world violence or shootings. The real leading factors behind these are way more complex, such as mental health issues, socioeconomic conditions, and particularly in the US, access to firearms. My personal take here is that there's sort of a conflation of data. While I don't believe that video games themselves create violent people, I do believe that elements of gaming culture provide a space that both attracts and harbors individuals prone to aggressive behavior. Gaming culture is one that not only normalizes toxicity and hostility and what I would consider to be maladapted social behavior, but it actually rewards it. It's rebranded as edginess, and here, edgelords rule the social hierarchy. And here's why. Studies have shown that the anonymity in our online gaming lowers our inhibitions. It allows players to act aggressively without real-world consequences. It's called the online disinhibition effect, and it can lead to a cycle where toxic behavior becomes the norm. And it doesn't end there. Echo chambers in gaming communities can sometimes create environments where extremist and violence behaviors gain traction. And while it's important to acknowledge that most gamers don't actually engage with these fringe groups, those prone to violent and aggressive behavior do find validation and support within them. Gaming culture also celebrates hypermasculinity, domination, and aggression, which will appeal to individuals already kind of prone to violent behavior. Essentially, the problem isn't the video games themselves, but it's the unchecked culture around them. Some see it as harmless realism, others a troubling connection to a controversial industry. Ruling out video games cause violence, are there more valid moral dilemmas when it comes to gun manufacturers using video games to promote their firearms? To answer these questions, I sat down with Nazih Fares, an industry expert who chairs organizations such as the Game Quality Forum Global and the International Game Developers Association. And he's worked at studios like Activision-Blizzard on games like Battlefield and Call of Duty to explore the deeper moral dilemmas in the intersection of guns and gaming, as well as ask about his first-hand experience of these licensing deals. The first moral dilemma for me was questioning if this pursuit of authenticity in guns is really about enhancing the player experience or if it's just clever product placement. Nazih spoke to me about what these deals entail and the importance of developers maintaining accuracy.
Usually a legal team would knock on the door of these gun manufacturer, ask them if they're okay with the use of the weapon in the game, of the design, or even the name, right? The American company Glock, they're super famous for not wanting game developers to use their weapon without their consent and paying a license fee. But other companies don't really care. They see it more of a free publicity.
I also asked him about the transparency of these deals. It seems like an obvious thing once you say it out loud, that you have to pay licensing fees for a brand and its likeness. But should there be clearer disclosures so consumers can make more of an informed choice?
No. Even like filmmakers, they just rather create a model based on real life guns and not name it by name, so that any sort of legal team might knock on their door, take them to court for, bad representation or whatever. A lot of games have used this iconic gun, the P90, is just because it looks futuristic, it looks kind of like very Black Ops-y, but it's super rare for you to see it by name. You can assume that if the name is exactly the same, right, and there's some sort of flavor text about the weapon that is close to it, that I'm assuming that there was a sort of negotiation between the two parties.
My third moral dilemma is on the influence that the arms industry may have on studios. Are certain stories sanitized, altered, or scrapped entirely because of financial pressure or even incentive? I asked Nazih about this dilemma of free speech and artistic expression, and here's what he had to say.
I don't believe gun manufacturers have any saying in the actual content beyond what their, intellectual property or license might incite. There was some occasions where I remember gun manufacturers, being approached by a legal team, being told, yeah, you can use that model, that gun, this weapon, etc., or these attachment or whatever it is on that front. As long as they're not portrayed in any sort of illegal or, breaching of any sort of international laws, right? Like things like war crimes, etc. I will, though, mention that it's quite rare that a weapon manufacturer might actually ask for anything. I'm not saying like they don't have gain in this, right? Like obviously they do. It is a product placement whether they wanted it or not. Because at the end, most game makers, they want to bring a sense of realism.
With the arms industry having such a strong influence politically in the real world, I wanted to hear Nazih's thoughts on how and if these politics influenced game studios.
There might be some deals that are happening way beyond, my pay grade. There is some insinuation that it might have happened. Bobby Kotick did create an entire veteran, solidarity and like a non-profit organization to kind of like support veterans in the US. This connection is there. There is some political agenda that people like Bobby Kotick might have, right? Like he's a staunch Republican. He has funded a lot of Republican Party super PACs and PACs and whatnot, borderline war criminals that are still senators or representative in the US. All of these first-person shooters in general, especially any sort of warfare-themed games, especially things that are very realistic, based on some live events, like the Black Ops 6, based on like Saddam Hussein's attack on Kuwait. Whether we like it or not, these video games will end up indirectly or directly funding the arms manufacturer, and that's the sad part. It's marketing guns to young people. There's so many parents that haven't set up parental control on their kids' Xbox nowadays, and their kids will probably download Black Ops 6 and play a game. Experience these weapons. I'm gonna be super honest. In my time when I used to work in gaming distribution, most of the sales for games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, especially shooters, were mostly kids under the age of 16, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. It's still hard to kind of quantify or to what sort of extent having these guns, these real life representation of guns, will do to increase sales for these gun manufacturer, but the exposure is there.
Many gamers, maybe even you if you clicked on this video, may be unaware that by purchasing and playing certain games, they're indirectly supporting the gun industry. And for gamers who oppose gun violence or who even live in regions heavily affected by it, there may be a moral conflict. So I asked Nazih about his opinion on the ethics of developers involving players in the support of the arms industry, even if it is indirectly.
It is a systemic problem, right? I don't think we should market any sort of, hurrah moment, guns blazing kind of thing, right? Especially in the context of being and again, it's very weird for me to say that because in 2 years ago, we've launched a game that was all about that, right? That was set in a sort of a futuristic World War III era, what if, the whole world turned to shit and every single country in the world is like fighting for the last bits of resource. And yes, the whole aspect of being as realistic as possible was there, right? We wanted to make sure that these guns were, had the same feel as the real guns, right? Like recoil value. Again, not to an extent of promoting the guns, but more about promoting realism. And that was one of, one of the pillar of the design aspect of the game is to be as realistic as possible from firearms all the way to, let's say, support accessories and stuff like that, you know, like jackets, leather, like Kevlars, headset, you know, night vision goggles, whatnot. So it's a bit weird to say that it is a systemic problem, right? It is, after all, it is a business. There's so much you can do to, you know, as an individual, to try to show your better side of your values, right? And that you're obviously not promoting warfare or promoting killing others and whatnot. And again, you know, like any sort of art, it is open to interpretation, right? Like this is a game, this is an experience, right? It is always at the end, it needs to be clear that this is not a promotion of any sort of violence. And you see it from movies all the way to video games. It looks like you're the superhero and your guns blazing, killing 200, 300 people in the game with no remorse, no emotional connection to these deaths. That is going to affect the mentality of people, right, on the long run. But most license deals are happening or super protected by NDAs, right? And whether, you know, we knock on the door of Barrett or Glock or whatnot and ask them, hey, which specific gun from your, you know, from your let's say catalog has been featured in this game, and they will probably just tell you like, nope, that you know, our license agreement, you know, kind of prohibits us from talking about these deals and whatnot, so we can't really talk about it, right? But the damage is there, right? Like you have, you know, you have this sort of indirect promotion of these brands and these tools and these guns. And the sad reality is that a lot of the guns that are in these games are actually also sold as hunting guns, especially like Barrett. You probably go to their website, you will see a lot of hunting weapons, right? But these guns have military use to them. There's some of the most used sniper rifles in different armies around the world, saying like, oh, it's just a humble sniper rifle from Barrett that can be used to kill a deer. Yeah, but so many people died from these kind of weapons, so many innocent civilians.
So in summary, video games have become a surprisingly complex intersection of realism, ethics, and financial interests. On one side, real-world firearms in games enhance authenticity and immersion. But on the other side, if we're technically paying for them to be there, or if manufacturers are pushing certain firearms to gamers, the line between authenticity and commercial exploitation, even to the point of blatant advertising, is blurred. It would also be fair to say, though, that there are greater systemic and established legal practices at play, and the responsibility for change, if any, should not be on devs or studios themselves. However, those studios should be conscious of the stories that they choose to tell and to mitigate the glorification of something that has the power to do so much real-world harm. I also found it surprising to learn that some studios who vehemently maintain to be apolitical are using funds that they've earned from their games to fund their political beliefs.
I don't think it's a political game.
Really?
But the thing is that people read into that in different ways, right?
Yeah,
like
that's a tough, like, what do you mean by political?
That doesn't mean anything, right? The question, is this a political game, doesn't actually mean anything, because it's what does the word political mean to you?
I'm really happy that there seems to be more of a freedom of artistic expression, and that these arms manufacturers aren't fully dictating the stories told in games, which was a suspicion of mine. There also doesn't seem to be a financial dependence on funds received from arms manufacturers either. Rather, it's just a standard, licensing fees are paid to them if studios choose to use their guns. What is clear is this: video games don't exist in a vacuum. They reflect the industry's cultures and politics that shape them. And when real-world firearms show up in our digital loadouts, they bring more than just authenticity. There is a price tag, a marketing strategy, and a set of ethical dilemmas that most players don't see. We've seen how licensing deals link to the entertainment industry, and how game studios have to navigate this blurry space between realism and responsibility, and how some fictional worlds can be influenced by real-world agendas. The line between art and advertisement is thinner than ever, and for some studios, maybe even irrelevant. As the industry evolves, developers will have to keep making tough choices. between artistic freedom and commercial influence, between creative innovation and consumer expectation. And as players, we don't just consume these worlds, we help shape them. So our choice in the games we play matter too. So while the gun in your loadout might just be your go-to, it's also part of a much bigger story. Thank you for watching, and if you found this insightful and want to see more videos breaking down the hidden systems behind the games we play, please hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.